From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
The problem is a term and condition in the Facebook agreement, which of course nobody ever reads. And it applies to teen subscribers who theoretically cannot have contracts held against them, but theoretically simply by subscribing because of the term and condition, they agree that not only they have consented to the capture of anything they post, whether it be a photograph or a comment or whatever, and its retransmission by Facebook to anybody Facebook chooses for any purpose whatever, and they also agree that their parents have consented. That's all in a term and condition that, of course, none of them ever know about.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
And we also have the man of the hour. His name is Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. This is going to challenge our listeners' concentration. Very important subjects today.
Yes. I just want to say I hope everyone had a fun 4th of July. And unlike most podcasts, radio, broadcast, and cable television, we here at the Ralph Nader Radio Hour like to take deep dives into foundational issues. We don't do much about the power struggles, the horse races, and the palace intrigue going on inside the Beltway in D.C. And today's show is no exception. In the first half of the show today, we're going to be talking about war and peace, how best to avoid war and wage peace. And we're going to be doing that with a veteran diplomat, Ambassador Thomas Graham, who is a leading figure in the process of nuclear disarmament for over a quarter century and is a member of the National Advisory Board of the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. I'm hoping we'll get some insight into what he thinks is really going on between Donald Trump and his doppelganger, Kim Jong-un, and whether we can all, as President Trump said after his summit, sleep well tonight. In the second half of the show, we welcome back friend of the program, longtime Ralph associate, the original Nader's Raider, Robert Felmuth. He founded the Child Advocacy Institute at the University of San Diego Law School and has some very strong opinions about online privacy and internet anonymity, especially as it regards the rights of children. He's got some reforms he believes Facebook should institute to that end. Somewhere in between, we'll check in with our trusty crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, and his latest dispatch from the corporate crime wars. And if we have time, we'll get to some listener questions. But first, let's greet our first guest, not only a veteran diplomat, but a former classmate of Ralph's at Princeton. David?
Thomas Graham is a former senior U.S. diplomat who was involved in the negotiation of every single international arms control and non-proliferation agreement from 1970 to 1997. This includes SALT treaties, the START treaties, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. He was President Bill Clinton's special representative for arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. Throughout his career, Ambassador Graham has worked with 6 U.S. presidents, including Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ambassador Thomas Graham.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you indeed, Tom. As David pointed out, you were a classmate of ours at Princeton in the class of 1955. Nobody would have dreamed that you would become a citizen hero, that you would become a major factor in these non-proliferation and arms control treaties that we've signed with the Soviet Union and other countries. Real, detailed, lawyerly work as a civil servant in the U.S. government. You've written an article recently called The Alternative Route. Q&A is with Ambassador Thomas Graham, Jr., and you indicated that there wasn't much prospect of extending or updating nuclear arms control agreements with Russia or other countries. You wanted us to pay attention to what you called the nuclear weapon-free zones. And most people don't know about this, and you started with the example of South America. Can you tell our listeners about what nuclear weapon-free zones are, because that's a real source of optimism?
I would be happy to do that. Ralph, it's actually a book, not an article. It's about 350 pages long. And the thesis is that since our relationship with Russia has essentially failed since the return of Putin to the presidency, we don't have our longtime disarmament arms control partner, at least at present and for the foreseeable future. So if the U.S. wants to pursue arms reductions, reduction of nuclear weapons and so forth, we may not be able to do that with the standard approach is the U.S. and Russia act first, and then we try to impose our regime on the rest of the world. That's the classic way we have done it. So there is a group of 5 or 6 treaties that exist. And the first one was signed in 1967, the last one just a few years ago, the early part of the century. And they're called nuclear weapon-free zone arrangements that are made by these treaties. And what it provides is that the countries of the region band together and declare that nuclear weapons will never be allowed within their region. And they have very elaborate verification arrangements, and the prohibition on nuclear weapons is quite strictly outlined. Nuclear power, on the other hand, is favored by these treaties because many of these countries are third world countries that want access to that type of technology. I mean, peaceful nuclear power, nuclear reactors, nuclear medicine, and so on. And then these treaties also have protocols by which the relevant countries outside the region can adhere themselves to the treaty. There's one protocol for the 5 nuclear weapon states recognized by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the U.S., the United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France. And in those protocols, the P5 as they're known as, the nuclear weapon states pledge to observe, to respect the zone and not try to put nuclear weapons on any territories within the zone. And they also agree in a legally binding commitment never to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against parties to these treaties.
Tom Graham, let's talk about the biggest one that has been established. 33 countries in South America, a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty.
Well, that one, that's called the Treaty on Tlatelolco, which is a district of Mexico City where it was negotiated. It's an Aztec name. And it now has in all of Latin America are parties to it, including Cuba. And the U.S. has signed and ratified the 2 protocols to it, one in which we guarantee we'll never use nuclear weapons against Latin America, and 2, we put our territories in the zone under the zone's obligations. So Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are both legally nuclear weapon free.
And you indicate that a slight majority of the countries of the world and a slight majority of the land area of the world are included in various regional free zone treaties. I never realized that. What are the other areas besides South America?
It's Latin America up to the Mexican border with the U.S. and all of Central America too. And there's South Pacific, all of the South Pacific, Africa, all of Africa, Central Asia, the 5, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth, Muslim states just to the south of Central Asia, and then Southeast Asia, the 10 nations of Southeast Asia.
As you argue in your book, which I neglected to mention at the beginning, published by the Oregon State University Press, your new book, The Alternate Route, Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones, by Thomas Graham, you argue that that's where we should put our effort right now to expand the nuclear weapons-free zone concept to new areas. And so I have 2 questions. What are some of the new areas that wouldn't require negotiating with Russia or China? And would any of these areas be possible, like Scandinavia, which is so close to NATO?
Well, the three areas that I think have to be addressed first are all three very difficult. But right now, if we want to progress with further reductions, that's all there is. Now, the most controversial and perhaps the most important one is the Middle East, and Iran and Israel being the principal countries that are focused on, although there's a number of other countries that have flirted with nuclear weapons like Syria, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. That's a tall order, but many countries have been calling for that for a long, long time, and to some extent the future of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty depends on progress there. That's been a fairly recent development, but it's an important one. The other two are Northeast Asia, which we know and love now because of the discussions with Kim Jong-un. That's technically much easier in that there's only one country that you're worried about in terms of nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, it's a country that's probably never going to give up its nuclear weapons, short of the world giving up its nuclear weapons. And so that has its own difficulty. And then the third one is South Asia, India and Pakistan, by far the most difficult of the three, and they're all difficult. But that one, in some ways, is very, very important as well because they've had so many wars there and near wars, and now both countries have nuclear weapons widely deployed on their territories. They're armed to the teeth. They're building nuclear submarines. They have missiles and bombers. And if there ever is a nuclear war in South Asia, the debris from that will spread around the world and create starvation and nuclear winter everywhere. So we all have a stake in that. Scandinavia and places like that, I think it'd be difficult to separate them from NATO, even though they're not part of NATO. And I think that if we ever get that far, which is probably sometime in the future, they would be among the last. But I'm not saying all this is easy, but it's right now all we've got. And certainly Vladimir Putin's not too easy either.
Well, if people listening think this is all pie in the sky, we all thought it was pie in the sky before you and others negotiated the arms control agreement with the Soviet Union, where Soviet inspectors came to the U.S. and U.S. inspectors came to the Soviet Union in the most top-secret areas to supervise the dismantling of hundreds of nuclear warheads in both countries, so that the number of nuclear warheads that the U.S. and Soviet Union, now Russia, have is probably well under a half of what it once was. And nobody ever dreamed that the two countries would allow these inspectors in their top-secret sites to implement the agreement. You mentioned nuclear winter just a minute ago. Could you explain that to people who are listening who may not be aware that even if there's a nuclear exchange between two countries, not ours, the whole planet can be jeopardized under this concept known as nuclear winter?
Well, if, let's say, there's a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, so much dirt and dust and rock and so forth would be spewed into the atmosphere, much of it radioactive, that the winds would blow it around the world, and the temperatures would severely drop in most places, so it would drop so low and stay that way for several years that crops couldn't be grown, animals couldn't be kept alive. The food growing capability of the earth would dramatically decline, but the population wouldn't. And so it would be an enormously serious event for all of us should something like that happen. And just briefly, on the levels of nuclear weapons between us and Russia now, it's much lower than half. At our peak, we had 32,500 nuclear weapons, and the Russians had 45,000 nuclear weapons. Now each one has about 7,000, so it's quite dramatic.
And unfortunately, the U.S., starting with the Obama administration, has approved a nuclear weapons upgrade. They think our existing nuclear weapons need modernization, may cost $1.5 trillion over the next 10 or 20 years. Is that going to launch a new nuclear arms race with Russia and China if that happens?
It could. I mean, it's sort of uncharted territory what exactly that will lead to. It's argued that, it's just things like replacing old submarines with new submarines. But once something like that happens and it gets in the control of the bureaucracy, it can lead to other things and actually cause an arms race. And both Russia and China are doing things not that large, but they could become that large, but they're similar. They're upgrading their nuclear weapons significantly. And then, of course, we have the test ban treaty, which is not enforced yet, but the entire world now is committed to the informal nuclear weapon test moratorium that was started under the Clinton administration by President Clinton and his administration. And now all nations of the world have agreed they will never test again, including North Korea. I mean, agreed in the sense that they have said they won't. And so one worries that could be upset, too, with this buildup.
Well, just in case you didn't know this, Thomas Graham, there is an effort by some leading academics and peace advocates to put together a statement that they want to release calling for the denuclearization of the Middle East. And the petition is being led by retired professors of history, Arno Mayer of Princeton, Stanley Stein, and Robert Tignor. They now have a lot of names from this country and around the world calling for denuclearization. Are you aware of that? And what do you think of efforts like that? Do they really have any effect?
I was not aware of that, but I think that it's important to at least try to do something like that. Israel has a very sophisticated nuclear weapon stockpile. It's comparable to France and Great Britain. It's somewhere between 80 and 200 nuclear weapons, and they have very advanced missiles that can strike anywhere in the Middle East with considerable accuracy. And then, on the other hand, we have Iran trying to join the nuclear club, and they've been blocked from doing so by the agreement, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that our president has just withdrawn us from. But the Europeans are trying to keep it going, and I think there's some hope that might be possible. But what really needs to happen is that all nuclear weapons should be removed from the Middle East. We should have a nuclear weapon-free zone there. And Israel has an enormously effective army backed by the United States. There's no country or group of countries in the Middle East that can challenge it. And so nuclear weapons were built by Israel back in the days when it was uncertain whether they would survive, but that's no longer the case. A nuclear war in the Middle East would be terrible for everyone, and so I applaud efforts like that. I hope that the Israeli government someday will at least be willing to discuss that possibility with other nations in the Middle East and the nuclear weapon states.
In your book and in interviews of you, you indicate that the long-term advance in nuclear weapon control agreements is stalled or actually going in reverse. And you mention that the Senate has refused over the years to ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty into force. And I might add, there doesn't seem to be anything going on in terms of international negotiations between countries on cyber warfare. as there was on nuclear, biological, and chemical. Can you address those two and explain to our listeners what is the stall based on? Is it based on just the Republican Party or Democrats or what?
Well, a commitment to a comprehensive nuclear weapon test ban treaty was part of the political price we paid in 1995 to make the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty permanent. And we were able to, and the United States took it very seriously, we were able to develop a treaty in Geneva and get it signed. It was signed in 1996. And then in 1999, the Clinton administration tried to get it ratified, and it was blocked by the Republicans in the Senate. And it's been blocked ever since by the Republicans in the Senate. That's the reason that the U.S. hasn't ratified it, is the treaty word. And now there's, I think, 160 or 170 countries of the world that have ratified it. There's only about 30 left, and of those 30, only about 8 or 10 are important and I mean, that have any capability in the nuclear area. The rest of those 8 or 10 are waiting for the U.S. to ratify. They likely all will do so once we do. That means Israel, Egypt, India, Pakistan, Iran. I don't think they haven't ratified. If we did it, they would. How could they argue their program was peaceful if they didn't ratify it? Come down to North Korea, and they've just said they're not going to test again. So I would put it all on this particular thing, all at the feet of the Republican Party in the Senate.
And the cyber warfare?
Oh, the cyber, it's a very dangerous situation. It's a real threat. You know, countries have the capability to really seriously damage other countries through cyber attacks. You can bring down the power grid or interfere with air traffic control, things like that. I mean, very, very real threats. But no one knows how to do it, and there certainly haven't been any serious attempts to get, that I'm aware of anyway, to get a large group of nations together to see what's possible to do about this.
Well, let me ask you a historic question. You know, you look back in the 1920s, the U.S. signed a treaty called the Kellogg-Briand Treaty to outlaw war, and it's still in effect, although obviously it has been violated. What's your view of the Kellogg-Briand Treaty? Has it got any historical, moral purpose or any use anymore?
I don't think it does. It was a declaration by a number of countries that there shouldn't be any more war, and there shouldn't, of course. And it's a good statement to have, but I don't think any country pays any attention to it anymore.
I think our listeners will want to have an explanation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed by over 100 countries, and I think you worked on it, didn't you, Tom?
Yes, I did. Well,
could you explain it briefly? Actually, it's not that complex. It's being violated in complex ways, but it's really not that complex to explain.
No, it isn't that complex. It is a treaty that provides that the line stops at the 5 nuclear weapon states that were in existence in 1967, and the rest of the world pledged never to have nuclear weapons. But they didn't do that because they thought the U.S. and the United Kingdom were such wonderful people. It was a bargain, a strategic bargain. What we were supposed to provide, the nuclear weapon states, is disarmament and movement in the direction of disarmament, and most importantly, a nuclear weapon test ban treaty, which has not yet happened in the sense that the test ban treaty has never come into force after 50 years. And it got a big boost again in 1995, 25 years ago, when the treaty was made permanent, but it still hasn't happened. But it just provides that there'll be no more The 5 nuclear weapon states are recognized, but they pledge they will work towards eliminating their nuclear weapons. The rest of the world pledges they will never have nuclear weapons, and that's what it is.
Well, the present scene is not that optimistic. President Trump is not spending much time figuring out how to expand the existing treaties or renew the existing treaties or start a cyber warfare control treaty. And it seems with our pivot to Asia military policy, we're provoking the Chinese into an arms race. President Trump wants to open up an outer space arm of the Pentagon, not to do anything other than, as he says, dominate militarily outer space. And I just learned, Tom, that the 40th anniversary of Garfield the Cat is upon us, and their books on Garfield the Cat are selling briskly. And until we get serious in our country and have at least a fraction of 1% of the citizenry in all the congressional districts starting to read your book and others, your new book called The Alternative Route, Nuclear Weapon Free Zones, as well as your other many writings on nuclear arms control agreements and how people of survival will, never mind goodwill, survival will on all sides should gear up and become much more proactive. It's going to be a pretty dismal ongoing arms race that's proliferating. I mean, there's already a fear of accidental release between the Russians and the U.S. I mean, our Trident submarine, one Trident submarine fully militarized with multiple nuclear warheads, can destroy about 200 cities in the world in 1 hour. The Russians have similar capabilities. Well, what do you think is going to turn this around, starting at the grassroots, focusing on Congress, which I see as the principal leverage here, in addition to more media?
Well, Ralph, believe it or not, every time I make a speech on nuclear weapons, nuclear arms control, nonproliferation, somewhere other than Washington, I'm always asked that question. How are we going to do something about this? Why doesn't something ever happen? And the answer I always give is you've got to persuade your elected representative that it's really important and that his reelection might depend on how well he does on this subject. And it's just never been high enough up the radar screen. And part of it is education. The important part of it is education. People don't understand how dangerous it is and how we came on at least 6 occasions, we came within 2 minutes of completely destroying the world. I mean, completely. And within 2 minutes. And the last time happened after the Cold War was over. First 5 were during the Cold War. The last time was in 1996 when Yeltsin was told by his radar watchers that there was a U.S. missile on the way to destroy Moscow, and he alerted his submarines to prepare for a launch order, and then at the last minute chose not to do it, and it was just a scientific test that the radars had seen. Well, that could still happen anytime, and it's just not something we should live with. And the answer, we're a democracy. We can elect people to do something about that, and we need to do it. And if the U.S. does something, generally much of the world follows. We still have
I think, Tom, your point is bolstered because in every congressional district there are retired diplomats, retired military officers, retired national security that know that there has to be an abolition of nuclear weapons all over the world, including prominent former secretaries of state, Secretary of Defense George Shultz, Secretary of Defense Perry. People from both major parties have spoken out against this. So it's not like you're all alone back in the district here. And what groups do you think our listeners should connect with who are already on the ground trying to do what you suggest?
Well, there are groups, non-governmental organizations, some political action groups, but it just doesn't get high enough up the radar screen. And voters, when they have, let's say, a congressman representing them and he signs off on a huge defense budget increase for nuclear weapons. They don't make him pay for that politically at home. It's just ignored. And that has to change. Until that changes, we're not going to probably be able to get the U.S. to do what it needs to do. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's totally bipartisan. And many people in both parties in prominent positions have spoken out against it, against nuclear weapons, and they emphasize the importance of elimination. But the only thing I can say is I guess maybe it needs to be more education. There needs to be more advertisement, if that's the right word, public awareness efforts. But we've never had them. I mean, it's just never happened. The one exception at the time of the freeze back in 1982, long ago.
Well, it was done by two women who never were active civically, and they came out of Boston area and made history. It can be done. There are very enlightened rich people who can put several $100 million behind organizing all over the country, not just citizens with a lot of votes, but organizing perhaps the 100 members of Congress who already agree with what you're saying, but haven't mobilized themselves, making it an issue in the coming elections. It's amazing how easy it is to turn something around if people just drop their pessimism and move forward. There are peace groups, the American Friends Committee, the Unitarians, there are other arms control citizen groups. You've been active, others have been active. It just needs to step up in terms of accelerating what, as you say, the vast majority of the world's people want to see happen. Any last thoughts?
There's a last thought, just thinking about it when you said what you just said. It's not enough to say nuclear weapons need to be abolished. You need to do things that are specific. We need to mobilize the public to insist that these Republican senators step aside or join the support for ratifying the test ban. It's just, they've been blocking it for 19 years. That has to change. And something needs to be done about the Middle East. It'll be very difficult, but it has to be done if we're going to get eventually into the area where elimination is truly possible.
Which is why you want to also focus on the nuclear-free zones and expand them to other areas of the world, because South America is a really remarkable example of this.
Yeah, like you say, Ralph, it can be done. But
Steve and David, any last-minute questions for Thomas Graham?
Yes, Ambassador Graham, this Korean summit with Trump and Kim Jong-un, can we sleep well tonight?
Well, I normally sleep well anyway, but our sleep should not be any better because of that summit. I don't think anything was accomplished there. I don't think North Korea is ever going to eliminate their nuclear weapons, short of a general elimination of nuclear weapons. But it is a good thing that they have agreed not to do any more tests. They did that before the summit, and we should try to get that into an agreement between us and North Korea and have a peace treaty ending the Korean War. Those things would be helpful, but I don't think they'd have a tremendous impact on sleep.
Will we ever be able to shoot a missile out of the sky?
No, I don't think so. It's those things come in so fast, and they're surrounded by hundreds of decoys, and you just can't pick the warhead out of hundreds of other targets coming in at equal many thousands of miles an hour, or indeed hundreds of miles a second. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. I mean,
you're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, right, Tom?
I'm talking about modern nuclear weapon carrying missiles.
Why have we spent over $200 billion since the Reagan years, and we still can't convince leading physicists that it's possible to have a missile defense system against intercontinental missiles coming in with decoys?
Well, it's what they call feeding the industrial military-industrial complex, Ralph. When the commander of STRATCOM, General Habiger, left, retired about 2006 or 8, something like that, he said that in his opinion, the missile defense program had changed from a technology program to a theology program.
Wow.
And I think he's right. It's just not technically possible. And furthermore, even if there could be an occasional successful test, that's not going to be enough. In order to actually change countries' behavior and to rely on missile defense, it's got to work 100% of the time. You can't say to Los Angeles, well, chances are, if we do this, the chances are pretty good you won't get blown up by nuclear weapons, but not 100%. One might get through. That's not good enough. No military commander is going to change his position because of that. It has to be foolproof, and it can't even be partially successful now.
And Trump is pushing the annual budget for missile defense boondoggle from $9.5 billion, which is the budget of the Environmental Protection Administration a year, to about $13 to $14 billion.
I think it's one of the biggest wastes of money the government has ever gotten into.
From a Keynesian public works standpoint, the idea of just pumping money into the economy, does spending money on missile defense, is it good for the economy?
Well, yeah, it does provide a lot of jobs. It feeds the military-industrial complex. It gives designers a job to do. And, if you look at it that way, I guess it's okay. But it's a technology that probably, I shouldn't say probably, I do not believe will ever succeed, because it won't succeed in its mission. And even if sometimes it occasionally did, military generals don't rely on weapons that work part of the time. They want weapons that work all the time. And it's just inconceivable that every time a missile came to 7,000 miles an hour aimed at the United States, surrounded by hundreds of decoys, that we could knock it out of the sky every time. That's just beyond comprehension, in my view.
The new book by Ambassador Thomas Graham Jr. is The Alternate Route, Nuclear Weapons-Free Zones, published by the Oregon State University Press. I advise our listeners to have a neighborhood or a living room discussion on this and other aspects of nuclear arms control if we want to have a posterity. Thank you very much, Tom, for your life's work, and more coming by going around speaking and writing on this subject.
Well, thank you, Ralph, and thank you for everything you've done for the world.
You're welcome. Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye.
We've been speaking to Ambassador Thomas Graham. We will link to his book and the rest of his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now we're going to step away to the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. to find out what Russell Mokhiber has cooking on the corporate crime beat. When we come back, we're going to welcome back the original Nader's Raider, Robert Felmuth, who's going to give us an update on his campaign for anonymity, specifically his ideas for improving privacy for children on Facebook. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 6, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. After a woman's leg became trapped by a subway train in Boston, the bone exposed through her thigh, she reportedly pleaded with bystanders, "Don't call an ambulance." "Do you know how much an ambulance costs?" she wept, according to the Boston Globe. Commuters rushed to rescue the woman after she became stuck in a gap between a train and the subway platform. The incident occurred around 5:30 last Friday at the Massachusetts Avenue station, according to a police report. The gap was just 5 inches wide. Surveillance video showed passengers rocking the train back and forth to free her. The story gained national attention after the New York Times ran an editorial about the incident. Police said emergency medical personnel bandaged the wound, which would require surgery, and took her to the hospital. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman, and the other guy is Ralph Nader. Now we're going to go to San Diego to talk to the original Nader's Raider, David?
Robert Felmuth is a professor of public interest law at the University of San Diego School of Law, and he's executive director of the Center for Public Interest Law. His areas of expertise include child advocacy, children's rights, consumer law, family law, and professional responsibility. He recently contributed an op-ed to the Washington, D.C. newspaper The Hill entitled "Millions of Strangers Can See Facebook Posts by and About Your Kids." Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Robert Felmuth.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Welcome indeed, Bob. You're arguably the leading child advocacy lawyer in the country. Your writings, your litigation, the bills you've passed in California, your leadership of children's protection councils around the country. And you've been sounding the alarm, although not so much on the mass media, which doesn't seem to be interested, on how Facebook and other companies are tying children up in fine print contracts they never see, but just click on, and involving pseudo approval by the kids' parents to send this private information all over the world. And we're talking about millions of children. You quote an estimate of 10.5 million U.S. subscribers to Facebook between the ages of 13 and 18. Can you talk about these Facebook contracts and how after Mr. Zuckerberg's apology tour, they're still at it, exploiting people and violating privacy, right down to little children?
I think the jig may be up, though, at least in California and maybe otherwise as well. But the problem is a term and condition in the Facebook agreement, which, of course, nobody ever reads. And it applies to teen subscribers who theoretically cannot have contracts held against them, but theoretically simply by subscribing because of the term and condition, they agree that not only they have consented to the capture of anything they post, whether it be a photograph or a comment or whatever, and its retransmission by Facebook to anybody Facebook chooses for any purpose whatever, and they also agree that their parents have consented. That's all in a term and condition that, of course, none of them ever know about. And it allows Facebook to basically send something to, the rest of the school that you're at or whatever. Now, usually Facebook is not doing malevolently. They have a commercial purpose. They just want to take something you're doing or buying or saying and use it to go to a community that may know you and convince them to buy that product. It's a sponsored link type of thing, but it has these collateral impacts for the children. They're not, they may be making a comment about someone at the school or whatever that may have a commercial implication, but to them it's a tragedy if someone else finds out about it other than the friends to whom it was directed. And just to interrupt, you say a posting intended for 11 friends by these teenagers might be shared with millions of strangers around the world. Well, yes, Facebook has over 1 billion subscribers, and they could very easily think, well, this is really commercially blah, 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 and there it goes. I think for most kids, it's not so much people in China getting their post, it's their schoolmates who they don't want to get their post, getting their post or whatever. And that's a real problem. And the American Academy of Pediatrics came in with a brief supporting our position on that. And the Ninth Circuit, when we contested the Fraley v. Facebook agreement, which would have settlement of the case, class action case, which would have allowed the continuation of that term and condition. In fact, it actually would have specifically permitted it. They depublished their opinion, which is good. It was a terrible opinion, and I'm glad they depublished it. But now we have some statutes and initiatives in California that might affect this, and Facebook concedes that California law applies to them because they're located and headquartered in Menlo Park.
Your other cause is anonymity. So much on the Internet is brutish, coarse, slanderous, vicious, unsubstantiated charges that are reaching billions of people, raising anxiety levels, getting children to wallow in deep depression, sometimes suicide. And we've talked about this in the past, Professor Felmuth, that if you get rid of anonymity, you get rid of a lot of this stuff. Letters to the editor in newspapers have to be signed. People have to stand up for their opinions. Now, make the case for anonymity, and then go to the other side of the aisle and make the case against anonymity.
Well, the case for anonymity, of course, is that there may be whistleblowers who will be sanctioned if their identity is disclosed, and this gives them the freedom to expose harms and wrongs. And there's some merit to that. However, you have a number of remedies that can address that. One, of course, is your whistleblower statutes, which protect state employees and federal employees who whistleblow. And another, of course, is the anti-SLAPP laws in many states now, which limit the ability to go after someone for libel unless it allows the defendant to perhaps get the attorney's fees paid and so forth. And those are two very effective laws to protect actual whistleblowers. The problem is the anonymity is everywhere, and you have all of these hubs or websites or whatever who are transmitting messages to and from. And my point, Ralph, is that I really think the First Amendment doesn't just involve uttering. It doesn't involve making noise. It doesn't involve speaking. It involves receiving. The audience has First Amendment rights, too. And to me, one of the most basic First Amendment rights of an audience is to know who is talking. That allows you to judge bias. It allows you to judge expertise. It allows you to arrive and to weigh what's being said. And if the Koch brothers or Russian bots are communicating to you, it gives you a right to know whether or not you want to listen to them and so forth. And now that we have a new telecommunications system, a new system in this country involving First Amendment that involves one person able to communicate to 10 million, 20 million, 50 million people to a device that's 8 inches from their face, it's really important that the receiver there has the right to choose what they want to see and hear and listen to and the way they should give it. And that means no anonymity. You have a right to know who's talking.
And where is this going? I mean, is there a move to restrict anonymity? I know newspapers, they don't have anonymity to print letters to the editor, but they give anonymity to their websites because they want to generate more traffic. That's what they've told me.
Well, Huffington, I think, is banning anonymity, and I think others will. But I think what's needed is for people to demand it. Facebook and the major webs or hubs of communications. I think that, you know, if you want to consent to anonymity, fine. If you want to say, send me everything, fine. But the point is you should have the right to at least know who's talking to decide whether you want to hear it. And I don't know whether it should be a statute or whether it should be a policy, but I do think the hubs involved here would be well advised to do it, because I think if you get competitors, heaven forbid that Facebook should have a competitor, but if you do get competitors and they have that policy, I think they're going to prevail in the market.
You have a bill in California legislature. It's Assembly Bill 2511, recently endorsed by the state legislature's Committee on Privacy and Consumer Protection, would make the bogus parental consent in the fine print to these teenagers illegal. Anything developing there around the country?
We're having very good luck with that bill. It does that, first of all, in California, which would be a very big deal. And it also addresses the issue of Amazon selling all sorts of dangerous stuff to kids, with kids able to, kids are very akamai, as we say in Hawaii, but they're in the know on how to order things and how to disguise themselves as adults. It's not just, getting beer from the supermarket. They know how to do this, and they're getting everything from BB guns to drug paraphernalia to all sorts of things that they're not permitted to have. And so the other part of that bill, 2511, requires some verification of age, which I think is important. But there's another bill in California now, AB 375, that addresses this issue beyond the child issue. And I think it's a very important bill, and it was precipitated by a initiative. Alistair McTaggart out here in California has started an initiative, and he actually got 650,000 signatures now, the Consumer Privacy Protection Act of 2018, and it's about to be on the ballot. And because of that, Facebook and others are saying, whoa, wait a second. And the legislature is now considering AB 375, authored by the chair of the Assembly Privacy Committee, and it has a lot of provisions in it which are very interesting and very laudable. And the major one is that you have a right to request all categories and specific pieces of personal information being collected by anybody on you, and the right to know where it's been sent, to whom it's been sent, and for what purpose, and the right to then say, delete. And that's a very big and important change in the law, and that, I think, looks like that might pass.
Well, before we get to your three reforms, and Professor Robert Falmuth, University of San Diego Law School, is all about reforms, not just diagnosis and exposure. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say these corporations like Facebook, Amazon, Google, they're just relentless. They're merciless. And they'll apologize and bob and weave and say they're going to shape themselves up. But they continue exploiting these kids, never mind the adults. I've called them electronic child molesters. And they just can't be allowed to regulate themselves. They're never going to do it. The history of the last decade has demonstrated that with increasing intensity. So let's go to your three relatively simple reforms that need to be legislated either at the state or national level?
Well, I think one is I think that people should have the option to at least know who's transmitting a message to them. That's number one. And they can opt out of that if they want to, but it should be at least presumptively that they have a right to know. And if they want to say, send me everything, fine. But that's number one. And number two is that children should not have their personal information stolen. And by the way, this bill I just mentioned prohibits any capture of any personal information of any child under 16. I think that should be under 18, but at least this bill has it under 16. I think it's going to pass, Ralph. And even Facebook is beginning to fold on it a little bit. They were opposing it, and now that they see this initiative that's even stronger, they're saying, well, okay, maybe the bill is okay. So it's amazing how these things can change. Yes, it's in California, but, again, Facebook will follow California law because in the case that I litigated in the Ninth Circuit, their argument was, oh, no, California law applies. They conceded that. So I think this will be a big change for them. It's coming, I think. I predict it'll happen. It'll be effective, I predict, in January of 2019.
And that's the second reform. And the third reform?
Well, the third, obviously, you don't want to allow postings of children to be transmitted without consent of parents to persons to whom it's not intended. So it's not just a question of knowing who's speaking to you and being able to know personal information that's being collected about you. It's also the issue of your children having their messages captured and retransmitted without their consent. And so that's the third thing, and I think that's going to happen too. I think that will begin to happen, I think, probably if this bill passes, and it may require a follow-up bill in 2019, depending on the final form of this bill. But we have some movement on our side here on some of these issues, not so much on the anonymous issue, unfortunately, but on the other issues.
I need to add another reform, which is, Facebook users have been trying to form consumer groups like Facebook user groups, and Facebook has militantly blocked them in all kinds of ways, including not letting them use the word Facebook user group. What do you know about that, and what kind of rights would you give Facebook user groups to organize? And that would hold true for Google and Amazon and other similar companies.
I think they can do that. My advice would be not to violate the trade name of the company you're examining, but I don't think you have to do that. I think that will happen, and I think it'll happen more and more. But the key to the potency of that is competition. The problem we really have underlying Facebook, et cetera, is a lack of competition. If you had competitive choice, a lot of these problems would go away because the competition would drive it away.
Well, in that respect, we interviewed last week Professor Galloway at NYU School of Business, and he had a number of startups in the early Internet age. He's very familiar with the whole scene, and he is recommending breaking up the big four, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, on the grounds that you just suggested, that you have to have more competition. They're stifling competition. They're blocking startups who can't even get capital invested if the investors think they're going to take on one of the big four. And he makes a very, very strong case, going deep, going broad, as to what these companies are doing in terms of minimal job development, what they're doing underpaying their taxes, what they're doing outside the consumer circle, in addition to stifling innovation and competition. So I urge you to get in touch with him. There are not many critiques of Apple and Facebook and others that go as deep as you and he does. The few critics that are publicizing these changes before it's too late and these quasi-monopolies really become monopolies and start raising their prices have got to get together, whether it's done on a state level or on a national level. How can people get in touch with you or any website that you think would help them take this to a new civic level?
Well, we're at www.cpil.org. But as a former antitrust prosecutor, the first thing you look at is what's called relevant market. And the relevant market for each of these four is different, and therefore they're each a monopoly in separate relevant markets. And that's a strong argument to break them up in the sense that you require competition in each relevant market so that you have 3, 4, or 5 competitors, and then the world will be very different. The world's always bad when you have one relevant market dominated by a single monopolist.
Could you repeat slowly that website? We often said years ago that Bob Fellman's fastest talker on earth. Go ahead.
It's www.cpil, that stands for Center for Public Interest Law, CPIL, 4 letters,
Well, thank you once again, Professor Robert Felmuth, author of books, author of articles, litigator, legislative advocate, child defender par excellence. To be continued, Bob.
Thanks, Ralph. Nice to hear from you.
We've been speaking to law professor and one of the leading advocates for children in America, Robert Felmuth. We will link to all of his great work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Ambassador Thomas Graham and Robert Felmuth.
For Ralph's weekly column, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
You know, I'm going to tell you to visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week when we welcome legendary investigative reporter Seymour Hersh. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember the book, The Alternate Route, Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones, already operates from Mexico all the way to Patagonia in Argentina. 33 countries have signed that treaty. Start talking about it, people. It's only the world that's at stake.
Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you.